a warm Doha greeting to you from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm delighted today to have a good friend and a wonderful colleague help us think through the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, what appears to be an intractable conflict. I can think of no one more qualified and no expert better versed in moving beyond this conflict and looking at various means of conflict resolution and mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned, a very good friend of mine, Professor Ibrahim Fraihat. Professor Fraihat is Dean of Student Affairs and Associate Professor of International Conflict Resolution here at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and he's also a non-resident fellow at Deakin University's Middle East Studies Forum in Australia. He previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution and taught conflict resolution at Georgetown University and George Washington University. His latest book publications include a book that I have with tremendous pride, Unfinished Revolutions on the Arab Spring, published by Yale University Press, and the book that we're here to discuss today, an absolutely brilliant book called Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict. This is an absolutely terrific book, and I recommend it to everyone to read. But before reading it, we have with us Professor Fraihat, who will help us think through, and he has kindly agreed to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we will go on to questions and answers. So without further ado, Professor Fraihat, my good friend Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mehran. Let me first thank the Iran Study Unit at the Arab Center for Policy and for Research and Policy Studies for all the great work that you're doing, and to thank you for this special event on discussing my latest book on Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict, that I hope can contribute to the debate on how better we can de-escalate this conflict towards a resolution that has unfortunately hurt everyone, not only the primary parties, but the other countries in the region as well. In the beginning, I was like to mention that I was asked to speak in Arabic, so I will switch to Arabic by some friends. So allow me to speak in Arabic, please, and then there is translation available, I believe, for everyone. Okay, so let me share a screen on. Okay, هذا هو الكتاب.
This is the book. At the outset, I would like to talk about the idea of the book or the methodology before delving into its content. The idea came through different studies and the literature that focuses on understanding and analyzing the conflict. However, there is a scarcity as far as the issue of putting a solution for the conflict itself. And that's what we need, by the way, taking into consideration that understanding is a must, but this solution is also a must. And that's why I just wanted for this book to focus on understanding the conflict throughout the 30% of the content, and then focusing on the conflict resolution. And this is my specialty, by the way. So as far as the methodology, this was it. And I had the honor to participate in workshops of the Track 2 diplomacy that incorporates experts from different stakeholders and former uh, policy makers, those who worked on such policies in the past informally. These workshops were conducted informally. I was a participant in some, an organizer in others, and so on and so forth. And these workshops were paramount in enriching the research content of this book because they were conducted under the Chatham House rules, whereby no names can be mentioned, but the content itself can be depended upon and can be mentioned in order to kind of have a creative way of thinking away from the dynamics of the struggle itself. So we had kind of plenty of ideas freely floated by experts from Europe, the United States of America, the Gulf, Iran, and other kind of areas. I have conducted as well more than 60 interviews with journalists, politicians, and pundits. And as you can see, we had also organized public events so that we could understand the matter further and raise the awareness amongst the populace, experts, uh, activists also participated in such public events. Why it is a chaotic conflict? This is the question. Uh, Someone asked me, are conflicts chaotic or are they less chaotic than the others? So yes, indeed, all the conflicts are chaotic, but let me explain why this conflict is a challenge or represents a challenge unlike other conflicts. If we look at the conflict between the Emirates and Iran on the three uh, contested or disputed islands, there is also the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that uh, 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 was very protracted, and there is also further conflicts to gain independence in the northern part of Iraq, in Kurdistan, and so on and so forth. But this conflict is to do with the uh, issue itself and the root causes and the definition of such root causes. And this is a great challenge in order to understand the causes of the conflict. You need to delve into the matter very deeply. During the workshops, we had witnessed a number of different points. The Iranians think that it is to do with the security. If you ask a person from the Ba'ath parties or the pan-Arabist kind of parties, they might think that it is to do with the expansion of the Persian Empire. It is to do with nationalistic kind of propensities. If you ask Barack Obama said it is an ancient conflict, primordial. It is to do with the confessional kind of struggle between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and it is intractable, primordial, and uh, it deals with certain structures that resemble the root causes of the conflict. And if you ask the clergymen, you would receive an answer as follows. Yes, it is religious. It is to do with the Shia and the Sunnis and the rift between the two. So 15 years or 20 years since perhaps 1979, more than 3 decades, 4 decades nearly, we couldn't understand exactly what were the causes of this conflict. There is there is also the issue of the parties to this conflict. I- Is it to do with the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran? I don't think so. We call it, yes, a Saudi-Iranian conflict, but it is not because there are uh, a number of stakeholders and a number of parties involved, and it is managed by proxies. To what extent the Houthis play a role? To what extent the militias in Syria or in Lebanon play a role? Is it a conflict between Iran and the Arabs, or Iran and the Gulf, or so on and so forth? So there is an ambiguity as far as pinpointing the parties to the conflict themselves. And if we look at the intra-party relationships, the relationships within the same party, who represents the Iranian side, for example. In the workshops that we participated in, we couldn't understand where the message comes from. Uh, does it come from Hassan Rouhani? Does it come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran? Does it come from the parliamentarians? Does it come from the IRGC? So there is also an ambiguity as far as the message is concerned and the messenger. We couldn't understand the intra kind of party politics. As far as the other ambiguity is concerned, in addition to the aforesaid, there is no consensus on the ground rules or the rules of the game of this conflict. What are the red lines? What is the permissible? What is the commendable? The attack on Aramco, was it a part of the conflict, or a part of the governing kind of rules of the conflict? The assassination of Fakhrizada or Qasem Soleimani, uh, were they operations that were incorporated in such a dilemma? So here there is also an ambiguity as far as understanding the conflict is concerned, and that's why there are three kind of levels: causes, issues, parties, and ground rules. These kind of issues make reaching a solution more difficult indeed. If we ask another question before getting to the solution or the way we could find a solution, if we ask the following solution: is rapprochement possible? Is the conciliation or reconciliation possible between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Gringos says that the comprehensive reconciliation or a full-scale reconciliation is uh, difficult, but at least it might limit the regional spillover. Frederick Weary thinks that Iran and Saudi Arabia are capable of dialing back and tempering sectarianism. And in the 90s, during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a security pact between Iran and Saudi Arabia during that time. So pursuing the tone after Iran-Iraq war in 1990 might lead to signing the 2001, or it has led obviously to the 2001 Security Pact, but the consulate is still far-fetched. As far as the thematic angle is concerned, William Zortman calls it the mutually hurting stalemate. It is self-evident. The mutually hurting stalemate represents the uh, culmination of the efforts whereby we might witness a solution. So, do we have a stalemate in this conflict? Yes. Do we have a mutually hurting stalemate? Yes, from my perspective. So, Iran is in Syria, Iran is in the region. and it has been subject to economic sanctions, and Saudi Arabia is in Yemen, and so on and so forth. So conceptually speaking, this mutually hurting stalemate, if we had an exit strategy or a way out, I think it might be possibly solvable or can reach a solution.
اللي هو يقوم على ثلاث محاور رئيسيه 3 pillars اللي هو لحل او للتعامل مع هذا الصراع بهذا الاتجاه. المحور الاول هو يقوم على الفهم الدقيق للقضايا، انه المختلف عليها انه لاي حد نحن فعلا هناك ما هي القضايا التي يدور عليها الصراع، وهنا طبعا تظهر قضايا الامن
and here we have the external factors, and to what extent are these external factors contributing to the continuation and the perpetuation of this conflict. The second aspect is the conflict management system is important here, because the organized conflicts are much easier or able to be solved. We're talking about the better management system for the conflict, that is how to prepare the conflict to be and make it ready for the third aspect, for and that is the solution, the conflict resolution. This is the basic idea of the book. If we take one of the first issues that is pertaining to the security dilemma, and this is what's called the encirclement. There is, in other words, there is a conflict in the security aspect. For example, in Iran, when Iran focuses on the American security bases or military bases, which is, so far as Iran is concerned, is a continuous cause for the conflict because of the American deployment. If you add to that, of course, the economic sanctions, and also Iran's expansion into Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, which in turn causes this security tension at the level of the other party or counterparty. We see the armed Iranian militias in the region. These are the two parties which are caught up in this cycle of mutual encirclement, by the different parties, which makes the security dilemma acting as a driver for this conflict in this direction. And this is an important part of the conflict. We also need to look at what's called the perception of a threat. And we can notice here, from the point of view of Saudi Arabia, there is sometimes tension in the relations between Saudi Arabia, Oman, or Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries in the region, and whether this moves in the direction of threat moving towards, or in the direction of Iran or Qatar or Oman, or all of this compounds the security tension. At the sectarianism level, the Western literature, by and large, go as far as categorizing this tension as one based on sectarian causes, although I have not concluded that this is the original cause. However, sectarianism is being used and utilized in this conflict by both sides on the grounds that this aspect cannot be separated from the tension, and this leads sectarianism to be a further escalation of the conflict. It may not be an original cause, but it has become an extra reason to reinforce the destructive conflict dynamics. Therefore, there is sectarianism at this level, which causes a threat. Some of the statements we heard in the discussions I held, an Arab Shiite from Iraq talked about the sandbags of Iran's wars, describing Arab Shias, in other words, the way they are being used by Iran to wage war on its behalf. And also, and some another Shiite Arabs said that they're looked at by other Arabs as infidels because they're accused of not being loyal to their own native countries, but their loyalty is towards Iran. I visited Yemen. I used to visit Yemen before the Arab Spring since 2006, 2007, and thereabouts. No way in Yemen I saw any indication of a sectarian conflict in that period. But now, one of the biggest threats which threaten the stability of Yemen, in my opinion, is sectarianism, which was a result of this conflict and an outcome of this conflict. And the Iranian claim that this is not a sectarian struggle or sectarian conflict, but at the same time, it's no mere coincidence that Iran's alliances are by and large with Shiite groups in the Arab countries, and this contributes to the sectarian tension in these communities and societies and compounds the conflict itself. So, therefore, how are we to manage this conflict? This is the second aspect, so that we get a better chance or a stronger chance of solving the conflict. If we look at the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, who said that the Cold War supposes or presupposes a disconnect and a lack of contact at the level of governments or heads of state or ministers of foreign affairs? Eisenhower invited Khrushchev in 1959, who spent 2 weeks in the United States, and also at the height of the Cold War, when the United States was just coming out of the Korean War. This visit took place. Richard Nixon in 1972 paid a visit to Moscow, and this continued contact between the two countries led to an agreement over a hotline and dealings at the level of experts. Of course, this is no solution to the conflict, but it provides maybe a better management of it. So, therefore, the conflict at hand, i.e., the Iran Saudi Arabia, requires this level of dialogue. Dialogue, of course, is no substitute for negotiation. A dialogue is aimed at learning, better understanding, engagement between different parties in search of common ground and solutions. This is all absent. It's not there. Simply even at the level of confidence building measures, this is not there. One of the participants in the workshops, he was an Iranian participant, said that we still wait for a simple word of apology, the word sorry for what happened to the Iranian pilgrims in Mecca. And until now, we have not got that. And this is a big problem for the Iranians. In return, of course, the Saudi side needs to hear the word sorry as part of the confidence building measures because of the attack on the Saudi consulate in Tehran. So, therefore, there is a terrible lack of management of this tension. If we get to the third level, and that is conflict resolution, the situation started in Iraq in 2003 when the regional order went through a period of imbalance. And maybe part of the solution lies in Iraq. In other words, the lack of the balance of power at the regional level. This may sound a bit romantic, but uh, Iraq's independence from the influence of all parties, Iran, the United States, and others, is a precondition. I think Iraq should be for the Iraqis. Iraq should have its own independent policies. This will be one of the factors contributing to the conflict resolution, especially on the security side. The Saudis sought a solution in Syria through the deposing of the Syrian regime, but that did not materialize. One of the other ideas I'm floating in the book is talk about West Asia. We have to get out of this dichotomy of Iran and the Gulf and remember that there are other factors. And if we want to take into consideration arms sales, for example, who are the sole beneficiary out of this conflict, and look for a security umbrella or some sort of regional balance security wise, including Pakistan, Egypt, maybe, and search of West Asia being one of the aspects of dealing with the lack of regional balance or the security dilemma. The other side to this is the need to discuss the domestic reform. This is linked, of course, to the security strategy and security aspect. In my estimation, there are issues, pressing issues inside these countries who need some sort of an internal or domestic understanding and new social contracts. And I think this will be the best or stronger framework, for example, for Saudi Arabia in particular, to stand up to the Iranian expansionism. As for the arms race and arms sales, this did not stop the attack on Aramco and did not lead to the desired outcome. Also, in Iran, we see that in the last 10 years at least, there have been many occasions where demonstrations have seen, and this also merits more searching into. And there is another factor as the soft power reform. There is a great need for that. There should be reform at the level of the soft power. This is ignored by both sides, Iran and Saudi Arabia. For example, at the Iranian level, the Iranian model for the area, for the region, is not appealing. It cannot be sold, it cannot be marketed in the Arab world. For example, As my friend Al Khoury says, if you ask any young Arab that do you want to go to Tehran or Dubai, the answer almost always is Dubai as a choice and not Tehran. So therefore, there is a real problem so far as soft power is concerned about Iran's image in the region. Also, Iran was the victim of the chemical weapons in the days of Saddam Hussein. In that time, in that period, Iran enjoyed the sympathy of the world, and Iran later on became a part of the camp which used the chemical weapons in Syria in support of the Syrian regime. And we must also remember that when in 1979 the Iranian revolution started, Khomeini's pictures were upheld and lifted in the Arab world. But nowadays, where can you find Khamenei's pictures? Maybe in the southern suburb of Beirut and some other places. In other words, Iranian soft power has been on the retreat, and Iranians should understand that they cannot achieve victory through long range missiles only. The Soviet Union had plenty of those, yet their image also was tarnished in the Gulf War. And so far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, they too have a problem because of the linkage between Wahhabism and terrorism. So therefore, also combating corruption inside Saudi Arabia is another need the Saudis should pay attention to in order to strengthen and consolidate their own soft power. They need credible measures, as we saw in the Ritz-Carlton affair. This did not achieve the desired effect for Saudi at the international level. So therefore, there should be more credible reform and new social contract in order to deal with the concept of soft power for Saudi Arabia, which can help Saudi Arabia solve the security dilemma, not only hard power. Of course, hard power is also important, but it's not only through hard power that people or countries, sorry, achieve victory. This was the strategy the Soviet Union relied on and adopted. They ended up in failure. The fourth factor here is there is need for reforming conflict strategies. Amongst the most important, there are many, of course, but amongst the most important is to how to deal with strategy on dealing with extremism and sectarianism. I must warn on a different level. Iran, for example, Iranians marketed their sectarian policy on the ground of fighting Sunni extremism like ISIS and others, but that led to an exacerbation of the situation. Iran reproduced its threats through its actions, and also they should Iran should stop considering itself a self-appointed protector of Shiites. This is important for the Shiites in the Arab world because they are, in the first place, citizens of their own countries, and they are not citizens on the basis of sectarian allegiances. And this, of course, leads me to say that this is not exclusive to Iran because Arab Shiites, like in Saudi Arabia, are part and parcel of the fabric of society, and they are important in the conflict, and it's contrary to the prevailing wisdom that they are contributing to the conflict until the Arab Shiite is give or are given senior government positions and full citizenship rights. And I'm not generalizing here, but more often than not looked upon as people whose allegiances lie in Iran and not in their own countries. I warn against the self-fulfilling prophecy here that if you if you insist on dealing with someone according to your perception on them, you will turn them into one like that. For example, if we continue saying that the Arab Shiites are loyal to Iran, they will eventually become like that. And this kind of strategy is harmful to all sides. And finally, I'm sorry I took more time than designated. I'll finish in a few minutes. As for the solution, we always think of them as top down from the leaders who produce these decisions. This is, of course, important. This is track one, as it's known. But conflict resolution does not come only through the governmental level or track one. There is enough potential and importance in dealing with conflicts through the track two, which is almost being made redundant now, and also at the level of people, which is also absent, even until there are peace agreements taking place at the level of governments and leaders, unless even with that, if the people do not feel and reap the benefits of these agreements and the dividends of peace is not felt by them, we will not see peace. I discuss this extensively in the book, and we understand from many think tanks in Iran. I was very pleased when I realized that Dr. Mehran now leads the Iranian studies unit. I want to be clear. I'm not saying he has become that because of my recommendation. Of course, what I'm saying is we need an exchange program at the level of academics, students, professors. This is not a solution in its own right, but nonetheless, this is an attempt towards understanding, a mutual understanding by the parties to this conflict. Finally, so far as the second track is concerned, which is also almost totally redundant, and I'm mentioning it because of the high level of centrality or centralism of the governing regimes in the region, there is a lot of potential which is not tapped into yet, and maybe paying some attention through generating ideas and a better and a wider understanding away from the main official and formal track. And in the book, I explain how, if the conflict is dealt with as at this level, most of the participants are opinion makers and opinion leaders. They are influencers. They have an impact and they can play a role towards the reduction of the conflict and not exacerbating it. Of course, they themselves require to raise up to the challenges and invest strategically speaking in this direction. Finally, I finish with saying that when I was writing this book, I was fully aware that some of the recommendations included in the book are not followed now. But of course, I'm not anticipating that the supreme leader or King Salman will pick up my book and find the solution through it. But, however, having said that, the aim and objective behind this book is to raise the level of awareness at the level of experts, researchers, that to make them understand that there are solutions that can be reached, and if there are any recommendations, if followed by both parts, of course, this would please me utmost, but I'm writing as from the point of view of a researcher, generically discussing the conflict in the region, and I provide solutions. More than that, in fact, raising the level of awareness. It's not my business, of course, to dictate terms to anybody, but I know there is potential which is not tapped into, and I hope the book will be a small contribution in this direction. My apologies again for taking too much of your time, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you again. Thank you, Mehran.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. This was absolutely fantastic. It's a very rich book, and to be able to summarize it in such a succinct and thorough fashion is a very difficult job, and you did it admirably. So we're very grateful, and I personally hope that both Supreme Leader Khamenei and King Salman pick up the book and read it and put it into practice. Before we go to questions, I should say that if our panelists have a question, they can raise their hand, and our attendees in the social media can write their comments in live stream posts. But please keep your questions brief. And Ibrahim, we have a lot of questions already, and I'll get to them. And I would be grateful if you can just be very quick with them. The first question says that asks, what will Iranian-Saudi relations look like under the Biden administration? Do you think the next phase, that in the next phase, Saudi Arabia would will look to Iran to fuel sectarian tensions through the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia? And then just along the same lines, I'll combine two questions. Another question says that Tehran uses religious doctrine to fuel national security accounts, and Riyadh uses religion to halt this influence. Is it possible for them to limit this influence? And will there be a difference between Arabs belonging to the Shia sects and others belonging to the Sunnis? You addressed some of this, but if you could address these two questions quickly, there's a lot more. And we'll try to, I should say, we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We may not necessarily be able to, but we'll do our best.
شكرا مهران. سأحاول الإجابة قدر الإمكان بما أنه في أسئلة كثيرة.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. I would like to answer succinctly, as there are plenty of questions. As far as the first question is concerned, unfortunately, I'm not optimistic as far as the new era and this conflict and addressing such conflict. There is the elephant in the room that I mentioned in my book, and the influence of the external factors, and this influence is huge, and it resembles a straitjacket that encounters finding any solution. The United States of America is interested in revisiting the GCPOA, and Israel is playing a major role in this regard. Mr. Netanyahu yesterday talked about attacking and so on and so forth, and preventing Iran from reaching a nuclear bomb. And also the generals in uh, Israel are talking in the same vein. And this kind of camp is adamant on diffusing the capabilities of Iran as far as the missiles are concerned, or at least including the missiles dossier in the future JCPOA or the future nuclear weapons agreement. Iran also has different calculations. We've seen the prelude of the new era in the last 2 days, and there was an escalation, as we've witnessed, on the part of Netanyahu and the army chief. And I think this would make the conflict more complicated because of the external factors. Unfortunately, as far as sectarianism is concerned and security, the two are, or the two reinforce each other, or the two are interlinked. We can't kind of dissociate security from sectarianism. They resort to any tool to be used, and Iran wants to help the vulnerable or the oppressed, but the oppressed they end up being the Houthis and the other Shia factions or militias, and Iran concludes such alliances and supports such militias. And on the other part, Saudi Arabia has also exhibited an inflammatory rhetoric, and it has a war in Yemen and so on and so forth. So the security is always linked to sectarianism in both cases. So that's why I talk always about managing the conflict first and foremost, in order to attempt to find a solution for this convoluted conflict.
Thank you, Ibrahim. One of our colleagues has a question, Dr. Ahmad Hussein. Go ahead, please.
شكرا دكتور مهران وشكرا أيضا للدكتور
Thank you, Dr. Mehran, and I would like to thank Dr. Ibrahim for this newborn, this new academic born book, especially when Dr. Ibrahim tried to put a diagnosis for this conflict through analyzing the various factors and the root causes and the power dynamics and so on and so forth.
عوامل مادية بالأساس
Especially as far as the security factor is concerned. Dr. Ibrahim focused on key concepts that do resemble the values and the principles, and how the identity of both parties were kind of formed. What I would like to ask about is the following: to what extent the defined concepts during the conflict between the two parties had surfaced, especially as far as history is concerned. I'm talking here about sectarianism and the conception of each party vis-a-vis the other. Are we talking here about the 1979 up to 2000? Are we talking here about the sectarian rhetoric? Was it manifest, or do we think that every party uh, uh, had exhibited certain conduct in accordance with the superpower, especially the United States of America? Here I'm talking about 2003 and beyond, when sectarianism was entrenched and the sectarian kind of identity was entrenched on both sides. And lastly, to what extent we can talk about the cultural kind of elements, the principles, the values, and so on and so forth in formulating such identity, such sectarian identity. Shall I answer, Dr. Mehran, or will you be
Yes, yes,
taking
go ahead.
another
Yes,
question?
yes. Go ahead.
شكراً دكتور أحمد على هذا
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for posing this question. Yes, you were spot on in your question. The relationship between security, culture, uh, sectarianism, and so on and so forth. Yes, these elements do overlap. And if I would like to talk about religion, I would say that there is a link between religion and conflict, but in accordance with our propensity of boosting our combating kind of strategies or understanding. If we have a conflict, then we might use certain conciliatory measures and resort to religion and the Quran in one of the verses where God Almighty talks about two factions fighting each other, and a third faction ought to follow reconciliation in order to find a solution. So we use religion in accordance with the different scenarios. But you were right. I would like to say that when sectarianism was afoot, the geopolitical security related hotspots were there. And confessionalism surfaced, or sectarianism surfaced because of the security related inflammatory kind of nuances. And this emphasizes the premise that I floated in the book, i.e., sectarianism is not an original reason, it is not an original cause for this conflict, but if the security is compromised, then one party would resort to sectarianism in order to escalate the conflict and to have the drivers ready to propel such sectarianism to brinksmanship. And yes, I think that we need to have into place a quantitative kind of evaluation by one of our students to answer your question, to look at certain kind of periods in such conflict. Let's compare, for example, the 90s with the third millennium and the era that followed the 2003 and so on and so forth. I think this will be a good idea to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Ibrahim, very quickly, there's a question on ground rules of conflict. You mentioned that this conflict doesn't have ground rules, and there's a question as to whether or not conflicts have ground rules. Can you very quickly elaborate on that? And then we'll move on to another topic.
Sure, thank you. مهم جدا أعزائي إنه يعني
Yes, it is very important to say that wars are not waged in accordance with a single kind of decision on the part of one leader or as such. Yes, the exemption is to do with a decision taken by a leader, like what took place with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. But it is a bottom-up approach. The First World War took place not because of a political decision or one political decision. It was a bottom-up kind of approach that led to the First World War. And this is what daunts me. And I mentioned this in the book because the well-ground rules are ambiguous in this conflict. When the war started in Yemen and bombardment took place, there was an Iranian attempt, an Iranian aeroplane was adamant on providing humanitarian aid in Sana'a, and this story is on YouTube. It is well known. But there were two Saudi airplanes that attempted to obstruct the landing of the Iranian aeroplane, and they approached the Iranian airplane. They were very close to the extent that the two pilots look at each other in the eye. So imagine if these two fighter jets, Saudi fighter jets, collided, or one of them collided with one of the wings of the Iranian airplane, then Iran obviously would say that this airplane was down by the Saudis, and then things might escalate. So the absence of the rules of engagement uh, is very concerning. What is allowed, what are the red lines? These kind of issues are lacking in this conflict. And if we go back to the ground rules between the USA and the USSR for more than 45 years. There is start one, there is start two, there's new start, and so on and so forth. There were agreements, but the ideologies were different. They were at loggerheads, but still they had ground rules, they had rules of engagement, and this what is lacking in this conflict. And that's what pushed me actually to write this book, or one of the reasons why I was concerned and was propelled to write this book. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If I could ask Mr. Khalid Abu Salah and Mr. Faiz to write their questions, that would be great. Ibrahim, there's a number of questions, and I'm going to combine them. These have to do, and we have a lot of questions, and I want to get to as many of them, but these are questions from earlier, so I'm going to get them. These have to do with regional dynamics. For example, if there's an alliance or friendship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, how will that impact relations with Iran? And that's one. And the other question has to do, related to this, has to do with competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Africa. And last but by no means least, the role of China and the United States, the fact that these two can provide competing camps for these countries. There are 3 or 4 questions. I just combined them into one, and I'd appreciate a very brief comment so we can get to the other ones.
شكرا على المساعدة بدمج هذه الأسئلة كلها مع
Thank you
بعض.
for integrating these questions together. As far as Saudi Arabia and Turkey are concerned, the answer is yes. In one of the chapters, and I mentioned this in my presentation, I talked about a safe zone for Asia. I'm not talking here about the Middle East. I'm talking about Turkey, about Pakistan. In Pakistan's national security lies the staving of any tension for a number of reasons I mentioned in the book. Pakistan wants for this conflict to be dormant, not escalating, because it has its own problem, Jammu Kashmir with India, and also if sectarianism is entrenched in the region, then this will have its own implications on Pakistan itself. As far as Turkey is concerned, yes, in 2015, by the way, there were attempts to have into place the Saudi-Turkish Cooperation Council to strike a balance for the regional order, but the Council did not see the light. In fact, the regional factors can, if we included these parties as stakeholders, these factors can lead to rebalancing the regional order that I talk about in my book, having into consideration that these countries are still here and will be here, and they are linked to these two parties by geography, regardless of the Trump administration or the Biden administration or any one who takes the helm of the White House. I don't underestimate the Europeans' role and the Americans' role and their contribution to find a solution, but the security uh, 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 architecture in the region, and this is linked to the first question, it is to do with the one who resides in the White House. It can go either way, left and right, in accordance with the master of the White House. The regional security balance ought not to be linked uh, with the American policies like Mercury that can change within minutes. And thus, it is incumbent on us to have self kind of measures to sort out our security in the region, regardless of the United States of America, regardless of the Europeans. Yes, we need to build bridges with the Americans and the Europeans, but they cannot resemble a barometer of our security in the region. Yes, last point, as far as Africa is concerned, as I mentioned in my book, here we can talk about the proxies, and it is expected for us to see these proxies fighting each other in Africa or in any other region, because this conflict depends on the proxies indeed, and it might escalate if the tension escalates further.
Thank you. Our colleague at the Arab Center, Ihab Maharma, has a question. Mr. Ihab, go ahead, please.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور ابراهيم لوجودك معنا يعني سعداء
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you, Dr. Mehran. In brief, I'll come back to the starting point of your intervention, i.e., understanding the conflict. Before talking about the solutions, I would like to ask about the American factor. I think that the American factor in this conflict is a very important factor. In order to understand this conflict, we need to focus on the American factor. And as you know, the Saudi Arabia thought of the JCPOA as being biased towards Iran, and as you know, it has been facilitated by the United States of America. So, what is the American formula here, or the American intervention, or the American factor? How could we understand this factor in this region? Yes, please.
يعني هذا برأيي أنت سألت ليس سؤال عن هذا الموضوع فقط، سألت عن معضلة.
Opinion, you're not asking a question, you are raising a dilemma here. We deal with this every day in our conversations. We see it in the media, we see it in our lectures. The question being, who is responsible for our defeat? Who is responsible for our calamities? Is it us, or is it the external factor, or is it the colonial powers? This is a non-ending discussion and debate, and there is always focus on some party. On some parties, always blame the colonial powers and the external factors. In fact, simply you cannot separate the two, the external factors and the internal factors. The external factors cannot have any impact unless there are those inside who open doors for them and facilitate their role. So therefore, there is a responsibility internally for increasing this dilemma or this calamity. I'm not saying you can determine the extent of the responsibility of one party exclusively than the other, as we have seen in the last 4 years. In the Trump era, our area was turned into a weapons market. Our region has paid dearly with its resources. Ultimately, Trump is gone, and we have ended up with the same conflict continuing. So you cannot ignore the role of the external factors, but at the same time, the United States is not the sole exclusive party responsible for our catastrophes and calamities. There are those who welcome the American intervention. They open doors for them. For this reason, this is an intertwined relationship. Both parties are responsible and bear responsibility, but if there is political will, there can be a rebalancing of the regional order, which was responsible for Iraq's departure from the equation in 2003, which was the main reason for the continued conflict in the region now. And we must not underestimate the American role. Incidentally, the United States, more than before, will not allow this dossier to get out of its hands and its influence, because for the time being, because of shale gas and shale oil, the United States reliance on Middle Eastern oil is no longer as it used to be. But at the same time, the United States is not also playing the same historical role. And ultimately, the book contains a chapter on how to understand the external factors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I should say, because of we're way over our allotted time, let's not have any more new questions. I'll just get through the existing questions, and I would appreciate, Ibrahim, if you could be brief. I know our colleague Hassam Al-Hamid has his hand up, so go ahead, please. And quick question, quick comment, and then we'll go back to the questions online. And not the new questions, but the ones from past that people have been patiently waiting to hear. Go ahead, please.
It's a quick question. دكتور أود أن أبارك لك إطلاق هذا.
Dr. Ibrahim, first of all, congratulations on launching your book, and I think this will enrich the Arab library. Maybe this question has been posed before, but how do you think Israel joining CENTCOM, the Central Command, American Central Command, how will this impact the Gulf countries, and has Saudi Arabia played a role in Israel joining CENTCOM?
Should I answer, Mehran, or you want to give me another question?
هل تريدني أن أجيب؟
Go ahead, Ibrahim. Okay. Answer, please.
All right. Yeah. شكرا عزيزي على.
Thank you, dear, for this question. In actual fact, I don't know whether you'll find this as a surprise or not. I don't think this factor will have a great deal of influence for more than one reason. First of all, the conflict is already tense and already very vividly present. And also, this kind of collaboration was there from before. All what has happened is it's it's being brought into the open now, and whether or not Saudi Arabia had a role in this, I don't think so. I don't think Trump needed any participation by Saudi Arabia. He went through the wish list one by one in order to satisfy and the Israelis and to secure support for him in elections. And there are things that he has done that he was not even required to do. Also, maybe at the logistical level, it will facilitate maybe better cooperation, and at the same time, it is a finale for the gifts given by the American right to the Israeli right, and it's part and parcel of facilitating the understandings and deals the American administration has built up over the years. So this will have an impact logistically, maybe.
Thank you. Ibrahim, 3 questions left.
Shukran.
Very quickly. One question says, Saudi Arabia sees the Iranian revolution as a fundamental threat to its monarchy. What can the Iranians do to address this threat perception on the part of the Saudis?
Thank you, Mehran. Excellent question. أتحدث عنه أيضا.
شكرا لك مهران. السؤال excellent question. There are many justifications which the Iranian leadership has given, if we go back to the dialogue and others, but to facilitate that, Jawad Zarif wrote extensively in the New York Times, which emphasized this point that we are not a threat to Saudi Arabia. And my answers always to the Iranian participants in workshops, what is required is not talk, words, it's action which is required, deeds. On one occasion, I begged them to deliver this advice to Jawad Zarif. It's not necessary for him to become a writer and a contributor to the New York Times. He is the foreign minister of an important country in the region, and he should do away with this approach that continually publishing articles to allay the fears of the regional powers. Iran has to be part of the solution, not part of the conflict. And in the book, I say that there is a problem. There is a war in Yemen, and the world continues, and Iran is looked upon as part of this conflict because it's one of the parties supporting the Houthis. Iran can work toward finding a solution for the war in Yemen, and because this is my specialty, Iran should seek a win-win solution, and that is if Iran managed to contribute to the solution of the war in Yemen, this would help it to achieve one of its aims, and that is to be integrated into the region, and it would become part of the solution, not part of the conflict and problem. And this would provide assurances for the Saudis and others that Iran is really about finding solutions, and it's part of the solutions in the region, and they should avoid engaging in dialogue through the New York Times, because that's the wrong address to approach. Because if you want to approach the region, you approach the region in the region and not through the New York Times. Of course, also the the Gulf countries also should not behave as if to think that everything Iran says is not true. Iran wants to get rid of the economic sanctions, and Iran wants to reach an understanding. And this makes the question of intent important, that the Iranian leadership should present itself as the party which wants to be part of the solution. And now I refer to the second pillar of what I talked about, and that is through mutual dialogue, providing assurances for all parties concerned.
Ibrahim, thank you. I had another question which you answered, so I'll just skip it and go to my last question, and that is, will you please honor us by coming back at some point in the not too distant future to carry on this wonderful conversation? This has been so enriching, and I personally have learned so much. Will you? I want you to commit in front of the witnesses that you'll come back for us.
Mehran, you made it so difficult for me on many levels. One is that I am definitely committed to the cause of peace and conflict resolution and de-escalation in the Gulf region, and in building better relationships between all the parties. So I am committed to the cause, and I'm committed to help in any way I can. So this is the first level. The second level, you know you are a dear friend, Mehran, and there is no way I would say no to you. So yes, you have a commitment and on my part, and I'll be happy to have to continue this conversation in the future, maybe when there are new developments, so that we can contribute and we can help. And together, again, as I said, I was so one of the best news rewarding for my book that I heard when your unit was established, so we can learn more and we can educate us also more. So this paves the way for better and peaceful and collaborative relationships among the people of the Gulf, and together I'm sure we can make a difference. And again, I hope that my book is a contribution to raising awareness on this level and impacting the narratives. I'm not expecting the government to start treating it as a handbook. I just want is for this book to impact the narrative in a collaborative, constructive, and de-escalatory way. And I would be the most happy and most pleased. Thank you.
Well, we saw by the excellent caliber of the questions that were posed by our audiences, both here in Doha and across the world, that there is an awful lot of interest, but also your book indeed has sparked discussion. And again, as we saw by the excellent caliber of the questions. And I also want to express my gratitude and our collective gratitude to our audiences for contributing to this excellent discussion. Again, sincere thanks to Ibrahim and to the team here at the Arab Center, and to everybody. Thank you very much, and good day from Doha.
Thank you, Mehran. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.